On the morning of October 21st, 1600, approximately 100,000 men stood facing each other across a fog-covered valley in central Japan. By nightfall, the bodies of nearly 30,000 would lie in the mud. But this was not simply a battle. It was the hinge upon which all of Japanese history would turn, the single day that decided who would rule an island nation for the next 2.5 centuries. To understand what happened at Sekigahara, you have to understand the world that created it. For nearly a century before that October morning, Japan had been consuming itself. The period known as the Sengoku, the Warring States era, had transformed the country into a landscape of fire and ambition. Warlords rose, warlords fell. Entire provinces changed hands in a single afternoon. Loyalty was currency, and it spent fast. The samurai tradition, that ancient code of warrior service, of absolute loyalty to one's lord, had become something far more complicated. In an age where lords were assassinated by their own retainers, where alliances shifted like fog, the ideals of military traditions and bushido were tested against raw survival. The samurai class remained the engine of war, but the engineers driving that engine were men of breathtaking political calculation. Three names defined the second half of the 16th century. The first was Oda Nobunaga, ruthless, visionary, a man who combined military genius with absolute contempt for tradition when tradition stood in his way. He came closer than anyone before him to unifying Japan by force. Then, in 1582, his own general Akechi Mitsuhide turned on him in a Kyoto temple, and Nobunaga was dead. The unification project seemed finished before it had truly begun. The second man was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the man who picked up Nobunaga's fallen torch. Born to a peasant family, this was a figure who should never have risen beyond the rank of foot soldier. Yet by the late 1580s, Hideyoshi had done what Nobunaga could not. He had unified Japan, not just through battle, but through masterful politics, strategic marriages, calculated mercy, and when necessary, devastating brutality. He was, by almost any measure, one of the most extraordinary men in Japanese history. But Hideyoshi had a problem. He was dying. And his heir, a boy named Toyotomi Hideyori, was only 5 years old in 1598 when the great unifier finally succumbed to illness. Before he died, Hideyoshi assembled the most powerful lords in Japan and extracted from them a solemn oath. They would protect his son. They would preserve the Toyotomi legacy. They would serve the child as they had served the father. 5 of these lords formed the Council of 5 Regents, the Go-Tairo, charged with governing Japan until Hideyori came of age. And among those 5, one man was already planning something else entirely. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu, and he had been patient for a very long time. Ieyasu was 60 years old when Hideyoshi died. He had waited through Nobunaga's ascent. He had bowed to Hideyoshi's authority when he had to. He had survived the Kangxu shogunate history that others had tried to build and failed. He was the largest single landowner in Japan, controlling the Kanto plain from his castle at Edo. And he understood something that the other regents were only beginning to grasp, that the moment Hideyoshi stopped breathing, the oath they had sworn began its slow dissolution. The third man in this story was Ishida Mitsunari, Hideyoshi's loyal administrator, the keeper of the Toyotomi flame, where Ieyasu moved through politics like water, finding the lowest level. Mitsunari was angular, principled, and deeply unpopular among the warrior class, who found his bureaucratic precision cold and his loyalty to a dead man's son politically naive. He was the man who would stand against Ieyasu, and his story is one of the most fascinating in all of Japanese history, a man who was almost certainly right about everything and lost anyway. The collision between these two forces was not a matter of if, it was only a matter of when. The spark, when it finally came, arrived wrapped in the language of propriety. In the months after Hideyoshi's death, Ieyasu had been doing exactly what he had sworn not to do. arranging marriages between his family and other powerful clans, quietly drawing lords into his political orbit, testing the boundaries of the oath he had taken. The other regents protested. Mitsunari watched with mounting fury. But the true turning point came in the summer of 1600. Ieyasu made his move, using a campaign against a northern lord named Uesugi Kagekatsu as pretext. The Uesugi had been accused of making military preparations in defiance of the Regency Council. Ieyasu mobilized his forces and began marching east. He was pulling lords away from the capital, drawing them into his campaign, testing who would follow. It was exactly the opportunity Mitsunari had been waiting for. While Ieyasu marched toward the Uesugi in the north, Mitsunari raised the banner of the Toyotomi cause in the west. He issued a 13-count denunciation of Ieyasu's violations, a formal document that named his crimes against the Regency and called upon all loyal lords to take up arms. He called his coalition the Western Army. Their cause, in theory, was the preservation of Hideyori's inheritance. Their enemy was Ieyasu, and everything he represented. Ieyasu received word of Mitsunari's mobilization while still in the east. He turned around. The campaign against the Uesugi was abandoned. Or rather, it was superseded by something far larger. He wrote letters, he called in debts, he promised rewards. Across Japan, lords who had spent decades surviving by reading the room now had to make the most consequential decision of their lives, east or west. Historians believe that many lords committed to neither side with any real conviction, keeping their options open until the very moment of battle and beyond. The Western Army, commanding the heartland of Japan and holding Osaka Castle, the great fortress that Hideyoshi had built, seemed formidable. Mitsunari had assembled a force that on paper numbered close to 100,000 men. Among them were veteran commanders of real ability, men like Ukida Hide, Shimazu Yoshihiro, and Konishi Yukinaga. But armies on paper and armies in the field are different animals entirely. And Ieyasu knew something about Mitsunari's coalition that Mitsunari himself perhaps did not fully appreciate. It was fragile, built from obligation and ideology rather than genuine solidarity. And one man in particular, a general named Kobayakawa Hideaki, had already been in secret contact with Ieyasu's camp. The trap was set. All that remained was the valley. The Eastern Army moved with surprising speed. Ieyasu, demonstrating the operational instinct that had kept him alive through 50 years of Japanese political violence, drove his forces west along the Tokaido Road, capturing a series of Mitsunari's fortified outposts before the Western Army could fully concentrate. The fall of Fushimi Castle in late August 1600 was among the first significant engagements, a brutal siege in which the Eastern Army eventually overwhelmed the garrison after weeks of fighting. The castle's commander, Tori Mototada, deserves particular mention here. A 70-year-old veteran, a man who had served Ieyasu since boyhood, Tori knew he could not hold Fushimi against the full weight of the Western Army. He knew this before the siege began. He and Ieyasu had parted company, knowing they would never see each other again. Torii held for 11 days, with fewer than 2,000 men, against a force historians estimated 40,000. When the walls finally fell, he took his own life rather than surrender. His name became synonymous with the very qualities that samurai tradition celebrated. With Fushimi taken, the Western Army controlled a key strategic point. But Mitsunari could not consolidate his advantage quickly enough. The Eastern Army continued pressing, and by early October, both forces were converging on the narrow valley of Sekigahara, nestled between mountains in what is today Gifu Prefecture. The terrain there was decisive. Whoever controlled the high ground controlled the battle, and both sides knew it. The night before the battle, October 20th, was wet and cold. Both armies moved into position in darkness, along muddy roads, through a valley thick with autumn fog. The Eastern Army, numbering somewhere between 70 and 90,000 men according to various estimates, took position across the eastern end of the valley. The Western Army, of comparable size, arrayed itself to the west and on the surrounding high ground. On paper, the Western Army held the superior position. They had the heights, they had the numbers, they had Mitsunari's meticulous strategic mind. What they did not have was unity of purpose. Battle began at approximately 8 in the morning on October 21st, 1600. It opened not with a decisive charge, but with a fusillade. The armies of Ieyasu's fearsome Red Devils, in their distinctive crimson armor, pressing forward on the eastern left. Fukushima Masanori attacked on the center right. Across the valley floor, the guns fired, the arrows flew, and thousands of men surged toward each other through ground that was churned almost immediately into mud. For the first hours, the fighting was savage and inconclusive. The Western general Ukita Hidei commanded his forces with real skill, pushing back against Fukushima's assault and holding the center. Shimazu Yoshihiro, the veteran lord of Satsuma in the far south, kept his clan together on the western right despite the chaos around him. Konishi Yukinaga, the Christian lord who had commanded Japanese forces in Korea just years before, held his position. On paper, the Western Army was doing what it needed to do, absorbing pressure, waiting for the trap to close, because Mitsunari had positioned additional forces on the heights surrounding the valley. Mori Hidemoto on Mount Nangu, Chosokabe Morichika to the south, and most critically, Kobayakawa Hideaki with a force of 15,000 men positioned on the slopes of Mount Matsuo directly overlooking the battle. If Kobayakawa charged downhill into the Eastern Army's flank, the battle would be over. The Eastern Army would be crushed between the valley forces and the high ground. But Kobayakawa did not move. An hour passed, then 2. The young general sat on Mount Matsuo and watched. His hesitation was not confusion, it was calculation. He had made promises to Ieyasu. He was waiting for the moment when those promises would cost him the least and gain him the most. Below him, men were dying by the thousands, and still he waited. Ieyasu, according to several contemporary accounts, lost patience. He ordered his arquebusiers to fire warning shots toward Kobayakawa's position on the mountain, a signal, or perhaps a threat. The message was unmistakable. Choose now. At approximately noon, Kobayakawa Hideaki raised his battle standard and 15,000 men began pouring down the slopes of Mount Matsuo into the flank of the Western Army. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Otani Yoshitsugu, one of Mitsunari's most loyal and arguably most gifted commanders, a man so ill with leprosy that he had to be carried to the battlefield on a litter, had anticipated the betrayal. He had positioned reserve forces specifically to meet a Kobayakawa defection. His men fought with desperate, extraordinary courage against the charging thousands. But Otani's reserves were not enough. As Kobayakawa crashed into the western flank, other lords on the heights, Wakisaka Yasuharu, Ogawa Sukatada, Akaza Naoyasu, saw which way the wind was blowing and switched sides on the spot. The Western Army did not simply lose, it disintegrated. Mitsunari's carefully constructed coalition, built on obligation and ideology, cracked under the weight of self-preservation. Men who had sworn to defend Hideyori's legacy ran. Others fought to the last. Konishi Yukinaga was captured trying to escape through the mountains, later executed in Kyoto. Shimazu Yoshihiro, a man of 70, cut his way out of the collapsing battle with a brutal rear guard action that remains famous in Japanese military history, fighting east through the entire Eastern Army and escaping by a thread. Otani Yoshitsugu, surrounded, abandoned by the men he had trusted with his reserves, chose the end that his culture demanded. He ordered a retainer to take his head so that it would not fall to an enemy. His last recorded words expressed not despair, but a kind of bitter, clear-eyed dignity. By early afternoon, it was finished. The Battle of Sekigahara, the great deciding contest of feudal Japan, had lasted approximately 6 hours. Ieyasu had won everything, but the full weight of what he had won was only beginning to become clear. Numbers tell you very little about what a battle actually was. Estimates of the dead at Sekigahara vary between 20 and 30,000. Write it down. Say it aloud. 20 to 30,000 human beings in a valley 6 hours on a single autumn day. Statistics can hold that number. The human mind struggles with it, but the dead were only the beginning of the cost. Across Japan in the weeks and months that followed Sekigahara, the settling of accounts transformed the country. Lords who had fought for the Western Army, and many who had simply failed to fight convincingly for the East, faced attainder, exile, or execution. Approximately 87 domains were confiscated or reduced. According to most historical accounts, their lords stripped of everything. Consider the human reality of those attainders. A lord dispossessed meant his entire household displaced. Family, tyrannies or attainers, servants, craftsmen, all the people whose lives orbited a castle economy. When Mori Terremoto, who had nominally commanded the Western Army and sat in Osaka Castle throughout the battle without committing his forces, was stripped of most of his vast western domains and confined to a single small province, thousands of people dependent on Mori patronage found themselves without livelihood, without position, without purpose. Mitsunari himself was captured in the mountains several days after the battle, having fled the field. Contemporary accounts describe him as exhausted, ill, but not broken in spirit. Taken to Kyoto, he was paraded through the streets before his execution, a deliberate public humiliation designed to signal the completeness of Ieyasu's victory. When a bystander offered him persimmons to eat, Mitsunari allegedly refused, saying that persimmons were bad for his health. The story may be embellished, but it has endured for 4 centuries because it captures something true about the man. Even facing death, he refused to abandon his own nature. He was beheaded on November 6, 1600. He was 41 years old. The ordinary soldiers who survived Sekigahara returned to a Japan that was transforming beneath their feet. The Miura samurai class that had been the instrument of a century of warfare now faced a world where Ieyasu was working systematically to make war impossible. Many veterans found peacetime service under new lords. Others did not. The Ronin, masterless samurai, would become one of the defining social problems of early Tokugawa Japan. Tens of thousands of trained warriors without employment or purpose in a society increasingly organized around stability rather than combat. One account from the period describes a former Western Army foot soldier returning to his village in Kyushu to find his lord's domain under new administration. His service records were worthless. His skills were unwanted. He had survived the most decisive battle in Japanese history and found the survival had brought him nothing but an uncertain future in a world being reshaped by the man who had defeated him. The women of Sekigahara left fewer records, as women always do, but they were there, in the castle towns that fell, in the households that were dissolved, in the hasty political marriages that Ieyasu arranged and Hideyoshi had forbidden. Some were taken hostage, the ancient practice by which warlords secured loyalty by holding families at their headquarters. Some fled, some stayed and rebuilt from whatever remained. History tends to remember the commanders, but Sekigahara was built from the bodies and broken lives of people whose names we will never know. On March 24, 1603, 2.5 years after Sekigahara, the Emperor of Japan formally appointed Tokugawa Ieyasu as shogun. It was a title that had not been held for decades. More importantly, it was a title that carried a specific implication Ieyasu intended the entire country to understand. His rule was not a regency, not a transitional arrangement, not a stewardship of someone else's legacy. The Tokugawa were the power in Japan, and they intended to remain so. 2 years after that, Ieyasu deliberately transferred the position of shogun to his son Hidetada, making the hereditary nature of the new order unmistakably clear. Hideyoshi's son, still lived in Osaka Castle. The Toyotomi cause still had adherents, and so in 1615, Ieyasu moved to end that uncertainty permanently. The siege of Osaka ended with the castle burning and Hideyori dead by his own hand or another's. The historical record remains contested. The Toyotomi line was extinguished. The Tokugawa shogunate that followed Sekigahara would endure for 268 years, one of the longest periods of centralized rule in Japanese history. The Crownsher shogunate history that Ieyasu built was, by design, a machine for preventing another Sekigahara. Lords were required to spend alternating years in Edo under a system called Sankin Kotai, keeping them under surveillance and draining their resources with the expense of travel. Marriages required shogunal approval. Castles required shogunal permission to repair. The entire architecture of Tokugawa governance was engineered to make the kind of challenge that Mitsunari had mounted structurally impossible. And the samurai themselves, the men of the warrior class, whose traditions and identity had defined Japanese culture for centuries, the Tokugawa peace transformed them, slowly but completely. A samurai in the 18th century was a bureaucrat with a sword. He might go his entire life without ever drawing that sword in anger. The codes and ceremonies of daisha military traditions were preserved, elaborated, even aestheticized. Bushido as a philosophical system was largely articulated during the Edo period, not before it. But the living reality of the samurai warrior, the man who fought and died at Sekigahara and at 100 battles before it, was fading into formality. The final act of the samurai era would come in the 1860s, when American ships and European pressure forced open the Japan that Ieyasu had sealed. The Tokugawa shogunate, undermined by forces it could not control, finally fell in 1868. It fell, in part, to the descendants of the men who had lost at Sekigahara, the Choshu and Sasama clans. From the far west and far south, the clans that Ieyasu had never fully trusted, that the Tokugawa system had deliberately marginalized for 2.5 centuries. The grudge of Sekigahara lasted that long. When those clans finally dismantled the shogunate in what became known as the Meiji Restoration, the samurai class was formally abolished within years. The last samurai era ended as a direct consequence of a single October morning in a fog-covered valley 268 years before. Sekigahara remains one of the most visited historical sites in Japan. Each year, on the anniversary of the battle, people gather in that valley, where the fog still rolls down from the surrounding mountains in autumn. They come for the reenactments, for the memorials, for the particular feeling that historic ground imparts, the sense that the air itself remembers something. But perhaps what Sekigahara teaches us, across all the centuries and all the changes, is something both specific and universal. That the greatest decisions in history are often made by men who are waiting for the right moment, reading every signal, holding their position through extraordinary patience. Ieyasu waited his whole life for Sekigahara. Mitsunari believed that loyalty and principle would be enough. Kobayakawa Hideaki sat on a mountain and chose survival over honor, and lived long enough to reportedly be haunted by what he had done, dying, by some accounts, in a kind of guilt-stricken anguish within 2 years of the battle. 100,000 men, 6 hours, 2.5 centuries of consequence. In all of daisha Japanese history, no single day cast a longer shadow. The valley of Sekigahara is quiet now, but stand there in the autumn fog and listen carefully. History never truly falls silent in a place like this. It simply learns to whisper.